This morning, we are continuing our study in establishing biblical authority. We're in lesson number 4, dealing with Old Testament patterns. And we have looked at the value and the purpose of the Old Testament record. We've talked about the revelation in nature of the law of Moses. We've talked about the pattern last Lord's Day morning of obedience. And as one studies the Bible from Genesis chapter 1 all the way to the very last chapter of Revelation, one of the key factors in this is obedience to God. Now, we understand that people have done all they could to not be obedient to God. And they've made all kinds of excuses, and they've set up all kinds of beliefs that we don't want to obey God. And, you know, if God had made us robots, then we would always have to obey. But He didn't. He gave us that ability to make choice. And because of that, we choose if we desire to be obedient to God or not be obedient to God. Now, as we noted last week, God desired under the Old Testament law that the children of Israel be obedient to Him. And we've also talked about how God dealt with the rest of the world, all the other people. And God would give them instruction, and He would expect them to be obedient to Him. It's no different when we look at the New Testament. Today, I want us to consider some examples of disobedience under the Old Testament, under the Old Law. And I want us to begin by turning in our Bibles to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10. Now, this talks about a couple of fellas by the name of Nadab and Abihu. In Leviticus chapter 10, beginning there in verse 1, it said, Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. The fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Now, most of us have heard this many times before, but I want us to look at this. Nadab and Abihu were sons of Aaron, and that would have brought them into the priesthood. So they were doing these priestly things. There's a better word for that. They took out their respective fire pans and put fire on them. Now, this was a norm. This was what they would have usually done. They placed incense on it. Well, the problem was that the fire they utilized was not the fire that God had commanded them to use. Now, I don't know what might have been the differentiation here from this passage. But the thing was that it was strange fire. I want to look right quick over to chapter 16 in Leviticus. And it says in verse 11, Leviticus 16:11, Then Aaron shall offer the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his household. And he shall slaughter the bull of the sin offering which is from himself. And he shall take a firepan full of coals of fire from under the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground sweet incense, and bring it inside the veil. And then there's other instruction there also. So the use of the fire pan, the use of the fire, the use of the incense was commonly known. In this passage, it notes that the coals were taken from upon the altar. Now, where Nadab and Abihu got their coals, it really doesn't bring that to light here in chapter 10. Wherever they acquired this was not that which was pleasing to God. And because of that, it was denoted as being disobedient to God. And what happened? Well, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Now that seems to me to be a little bit, what's the word? Some people would use the word harsh. I would use the word illustrative. In other words, folks, don't mess up. Keep the commandments of God. Do things as God has commanded us. And if you look at this passage and you think about today, if we do not do things appropriate to God's will, what's going to happen? In the end, we will be in that consuming fire for an eternity. You see the parallel there? Not too good a deal. Well, let's look at another one, if we may. In 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 28. 1 Kings 12:28. Back up one. Now, this talks about Jeroboam. And I want to back up to verse 25 to start this, because that gets us within the context. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25. It says that Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Peniel. Jeroboam said in his heart, "Now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah." So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves. And he said to them, "It is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods of Israel that brought you up from the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan." Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before one as far as Dan. And he made houses on high places, and made priests of among all the people who were not the sons of Levi. Jeroboam instituted a feast in the 8th month of the 15th day of the month, like a feast which is in Judea, and he went up to the altar. Thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he stationed in Bethel the priest of the high places which he had made. And he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 18th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense. Well, now this is up in the northern, what's known as the northern kingdom. And the problem was he wanted the people to follow him. He didn't want the people to be going back to Jerusalem and start following Rehoboam. So he sets up his own place of worship. What were the Jews? Where were the Jews to worship? The children of Israel. Jerusalem. They were to go to Jerusalem. This was again in the northern kingdom. This is what we commonly call the time that the kingdom was dividing. Well, here was the situation. God told them to go to Jerusalem to worship according to his will. But Jeroboam said, no, we're going to set up our own worship centers. Centers. Not sinners, but centers. Does that make sense? And so the king consulted. Who did the king consult with, reckon? God? Nope. He consulted with some of his friends, the people. And what did they decide to do? Did they decide to build another temple and put in the altar, the Holy of Holies, all of those things? Nope. They built them 2 golden calves. Did God command golden calves to be worshipped? Now, where do we find golden calf worship?
Exodus.
Right, in Mount Sinai, they did that, but that come from Egyptian influence. That's what they had learned in Egypt. Mount Sinai, we see the same thing. What happened to those nice folks in Mount Sinai for worshiping that? Yeah, that wasn't a good thing either, was it? They disobeyed God. All right, here we go. I'm going to set up 2 golden calves. I'm going to put one in Bethel. I'm going to put one in Dan, and we're going to worship it. Look at verse 30. Now these things became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. Now, I want you to look at verse 32. Jeroboam instituted a feast. There were already feast days instituted under the law of Moses that was instituted by the inspiration of God. But who had instituted this feast? Jeroboam did. He was going to do it his way. Now, continuing in verse 32, drop down to the second sentence. And he stationed in Bethel the priest of the high places, which he had made. Not by God's desire, but by his desire. And he went up on the altar in Bethel and had a offering. Let me look here. Went and had altar to burn incense. What's the word I'm looking for? This feast, this offering was offered to what? One of these golden calves, not to God. You know, this takes me back to that passage over in Matthew. You know, those that are religious but lost. These were children of Israel. They were Israelites. And they were, yeah, God, we're worshiping you through this calf. Well, today, think about this. Is there any religious institution in our world that worships in their minds God through another entity? Absolutely. There is. There's also those that want to rather than seek what God says for us to do, as far as worship, our lives, salvation, the list goes on and on. They decide over here that I want to make up my own directions. I'm going to do it my way. So that got them in trouble. And in essence, when we think about that northern uh, part of the kingdom, they ended up going into captivity because of that. And that's a whole nother study. I want us to look at David this morning. And I want us to go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now, this is the situation where they're moving the Ark of the Covenant. Now, God had commanded that the Ark be moved by taking two poles run on each side of the Ark of the Covenant, and it was to be carried on llamas, right? I messed people up right there when I said llamas. No llamas. No. Mules? Donkeys? Slaves? No. Huh? Priest. Had to be by the priesthood, moved by the priesthood. But we didn't have time. We were in a hurry and we needed to get on down the highway. What does it say here? Let's start in verse 1. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. That's a lot of folks. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal-Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. They placed the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it to the house of Abaniah, which was on the hill. And Uzziah and Aho, the king of Abaniah, were leading the new cart. Abadab. I'll get it right in a minute. Abadab. So they're going to move the ark. At least they got a new cart. It was shiny. Probably had all the chrome, on it, and not the nice wheels and the whole 9 yards, and they were going to move it. Problem. Verse 4. So they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Aho was walking ahead of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, with lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzziah reached out toward the ark of God, took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. Well, Uriah was not a priest. He was kind of watching out for what was going on. We have a new cart. They were having a jamboree behind it or around it. That wasn't the way God said to move it. And a whole nother study on verse 5. This was not what happened, but the cart nearly upset. Now, if I was moving something precious, and the cart or whatever it's on kind of thought it was going to flip over, upset it, what would be the tendency of most people? Reach up and stop it. Yeah, that'd be my tendency. But that's not what God had commanded. They were moving it incorrectly. They were not doing it as they were commanded. And verse 7 says, when Uzziah reached up, touched this, and the anger of the Lord burned against Uzziah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence. And he died there by the ark of God. Just for touching the ark, trying to do a good thing. Well, can we do good things and still not be obedient to God? Yeah, how we do it's the key. How we do something good is the key. We need to do it according to the will of God. This was the difficulty that they ran into in this context. Now, I want us to go back to 2 Chronicles. And I want us to drop down to chapter 26 and verse 16. This talks about the pride of Uzziah. 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 21. It says, but when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly. And he was unfaithful to the Lord his God. For he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Then Azariah the priest entered after him, and with his 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men. They opposed Uzziah the king and said to him, it is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and will have no honor from the Lord God. What was the problem? Uzziah was not a priest. He was not of the household of Aaron. He was not to go into the sanctuary. He was not to burn incense to the Lord. This was the job of the priest that God had given to those individuals to fulfill. But he was king. And can't the king do whatever he pleases? Yeah, he can. Is it right? Not always. Not always. And what he was doing was not acceptable in the sight of God. Well, it notes here that Azariah the priest entered after him, with him 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men, and they opposed the king and said to him, it's not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful and will have no honor from the Lord God. They told him to get out. This is not your realm. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. Now look at verse 19. But Uzziah, with a censer in his hand for burning incense, was enraged. And while he was enraged with the priest, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord beside the altar of incense. They're, in a holy place. He got angry because they told him this was not his place to get out. So what did he do? Well, he got mad. He just continued doing what he was doing, and leprosy broke out on his forehead. This was not a long time occurrence. This come on very quickly because God wasn't going to put up with it. God was not going to deal with this. So the leprosy came upon him. Now, the leprosy of this time period, the only cure that I know of leprosy at this time period was Jesus and the apostles that had been given the ability to heal. Y'all know of any other cures for leprosy at this time, this kind of leprosy? Wasn't. And it began on his forehead. Everybody could see it. Everybody could see that he had sinned against God visibly because of this leprosy. Let's look at verse 20 of 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous on his forehead, and they hurried him out of there. And he himself also hastened to get out because the Lord had smitten him. A leper in the holy place was a no-no because they were unclean. Unclean is a key factor back here in the Old Testament. You could not be unclean to go into the holy place. And the Holy of Holies was only for the high priest. No uncleanness could enter. And I want you to think about that. How many people today have this attitude that God, I'm going to worship you. God, I'm going to follow you. But God, we're going to do it my way. You ever see that? Ever hear that? I hear it all the time. Yeah. You know, it's always perplexed me. That's a big word. That people would write down, and I never can remember what they call this. I think it's just one of those things I block out of my mind because I don't. But they will write down, this is what I'm going to do for you, God. And I've seen some of it on walls of religious organizational buildings. God, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is how we're going to do this. I want to receive all the blessings, but I'm not doing it your way, God. We're going to do it my way. Can you imagine standing before God and saying, God, I've written out what I'm going to do for you. Here it is. Accept it. Yeah. That's what he did. God, I'm going to do it my way, and you're going to accept it in what God say. No. And he ended up, as it notes here, he was a leper to the day of his death. Had to be separated from the people. He was unclean from then on. What I was thinking earlier was people's confessions of faith and those kinds of things. They write it out and say, God, this is what we're doing for you. If you don't like it, tough, but I want all the blessings that's going to come. And God doesn't do it that way. Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And throughout the New Testament, excuse me, we find the ramifications of not following the law of liberty. And that's eternal separation from God. So God wants us to be obedient. Under the Old Testament, wanted the children of Israel to be obedient. If they weren't, they reaped the consequences. And of course, you go back and you look at the Babylonians taking Israel, destroying Jerusalem, all the other nations that came in and took them into captivity, all of those kind of things that God says, you were disobedient to me, you reaped the consequences of your disobedience. You think of the world before the flood, same story, and it's not changed. Same thing even today. So we'll begin talking a little bit more about this next Lord's Day morning, if He wills.